Day one of the 2022 Candidates Tournament is now done, and it did not disappoint. The venue looked absolutely superb. The pieces, the boards, the coverage, everything was on point, and we had a fantastic day of aggressive chess. So I'm going to look today at Alireza Firouzja's game, a very, very interesting one. He was playing like an engine out of the opening of this thing. Great fight with Teimour Radjabov here. Alireza had black. Now, there were some other great games today. I'll let you know the results of them at the end. I'm sure other channels will be covering those ones as well, but I'm going to focus on Alireza. I'll mainly cover his games during this tournament because I love his style. I'm really rooting for him as an outside chance of winning it, but I will cover some other games too. So with that being said, let's take a look at what happened here. So Teimour kicked off with d4, and Alireza does what I'd expect he'd do. He goes knight f6, and after pawn c4, he goes e6 here. So he's inviting the Nimzo-Indian if white goes knight c3. But knight f3 played. You so often see this at the top level of chess. And now they go back into this queen's gambit declined. So now knight c3 was played when white's committed d5. And now Alireza takes on c4. And this is the so-called Vienna variation. Now it's very sharp, because white can go e4 here, set up the big centre, which Teimour does, and now Alireza responds in one of the most sharp ways here, very topical. He goes pawn to b5, supporting the c pawn, yes, but obviously you're just giving this one away. Don't try this at home, folks. So after that pawn to b5 move, white doesn't actually take it immediately. Pawn e5 is played first. This is the standard way. You take the space. Sometimes you're then generating attacks down here later on using that pawn. The knight comes into d5, and now white takes the pawn on b5. And we've seen this tons of time. Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi, for example, played a couple of games in this position last year, so very, very topical. Now Alireza goes knight to b6 here. He holds on to this c4 pawn. We had bishop to e3 developing, holding d4, knight to c6 from Alireza, bishop e2, bishop e7, both players castled, and now the knight just comes back to c3 here. Its job is done, it's won the pawn, it wants to cover these light squares, and keep an eye on those highlighted squares as well, especially the d5 one. That's a really key battleground now in this game. So after knight to c3, black could go, say, bishop to b7 here. That's been tried before. But Alireza goes rook to b8, coming onto that half-open file. And again, white has options, as you can imagine, say rook to c1 here. But we had a3 instead. Now that's likely playing against this plan of going knight to b4 into d5. That's a very standard maneuver in these structures. But now after the pawn stops that, well, instead the knight comes to a5 here. I mean, at some point you want to activate that knight, because for one thing it blocks this pawn here, for another you want to start drumming up some counterplay on the queen side there. So after knight a5, we had queen c2 from Teimour, and now knight d5 from Alireza. He brings that one back to the centre, because with this knight on a5, the pawn is now covered. And here the rook came to d1, kind of discouraging c5 here. You know, black might want to break with that at the right moment, but now the rook's lined up against the queen. And so Alireza goes bishop to a6 developing, holding this pawn some more, and you can't actually win these pieces yet, because what you have to be careful of here is what happens if white goes queen to a4, attacking two pieces. Well, it doesn't quite work here, because then this rook can actually take on b2. And if, say, you take this one, well, we capture on c3 here. If you come back like this, we win this one here. So the tactics just aren't quite working for white here. You can't go queen a4 yet. And so that's why Teimour actually dropped this bishop back to d2. So now he's got threats to take on d5, open up this discovery here, all that kind of stuff. And so here Alireza jumps that knight into b3, plonks it on that nice outpost, and now Teimour goes knight to e4, activating his knight and also looking to now pick up that c4 pawn. So black has to be really careful here, because if white just wins back the pawn, you've then got a nice c-file pressure against this backwards pawn and the space in the centre. You know, very dangerous way to play for black. So Alireza now takes on d2, he picks up that bishop pair, and now a kind of safer way to play, if you like here, is knight to b6, but instead he goes for the most aggressive move. This is what we love about Alireza. He goes knight to f4, now the bishop takes on c4, and can you guess what Alireza played here? This is what he's been doing for 6 months. This is the preparation. He goes full Alpha Firouzja mode in this position here. So instead of just taking back on c4, then white's just better, he crashes through on b2 here. Just a fantastic exchange sacrifice idea, because after the queen recaptures, which is forced, you then pick up the bishop on c4, and Alireza's just saying, okay, fine, have a rook, I'm going to kill you on the dark squares here. So the rook now came across to c1 here. Now there's some subtle stuff going on. You know, the bishop comes back to d5, and then the rook comes back to e1 here. Now queen to a8, getting onto that long diagonal, hitting the knight, and the queen came to c2 defending. You didn't really want to move that one away, then you've got problems on f3. But by defending with the queen, well, now Alireza can pick up a pawn on the queen side. So he's got 2 pawns for that exchange. Who knows if this one could be a dangerous passer later. Very double-edged position here. So the knight now came into g5, and this is really looking to set up tactics on h7. So for example, we see this bishop come to b4 in a moment. If it came there straight away, skewering the rooks, well, now you're actually running into a mate in 2. You can check on f6 like this. If pawn takes, you mate here. If the king moves away, well, of course, you still mate on h7. So you have to be wary of this. That's why Alireza actually drops the knight back in this position here. And now these rooks are lined up for the skewer, but you can't actually save them. I mean, say you tried rook d3, for example, hitting the bishop. Well, then it can come to b4. If rook e2 to hold on to this knight, don't forget it's attacked twice. Well, then h6. You kick the defender of that knight on e4, and then this knight's dropping off. Black's completely winning. So it was no good trying to save the rooks. Instead, h4 was played. Great move from Teimour, threatening h5, going after the king, and this is so dangerous for black now, you have to tread carefully. So Alireza goes bishop to b4, h5 was played, and there was a couple of options for black here. The main way the computer likes is actually taking on e4, but after knight recaptures, then you have to see that you can go knight to h4 here, and this knight's actually really annoying on that h4 square. It looks at these sensitive light squares, but you have to see that after pawn h6, you're actually doing okay with rook to d8, but letting white take here, you know, giving up control of f6, it's just not a human way to play at all. Very, very difficult to calculate that one. So Alireza didn't take on e4. In this position here, he took on d2, the queen recaptured, now h6 was played by Alireza. And this is the best move in the position because it forces white to actually take on g6 here, then you take back on g5. Yes, white can take here, looks quite scary, but you don't capture with the rook, instead you take with the king. Because now after knight g5 check, this is all fairly forced, then the king can actually start running away here, and the king's actually coming to d7, where it sits a bit safer than it was on that king side there. So pawn f3 from Teimour, g2 was attacked. Now this king came to d7. Alireza's never afraid to just wander that king around the board, of course. Knight to e4, and you really can't let that one hit c5. So we had a chop here, rook recaptures, and now here there's a couple of good moves. You could go pawn a5. Alireza goes queen d5 instead. We had queen to b4 here, hits that rook on f8. It came to g8, looks passive but holds the pawn. And now if Teimour wanted to be a bit more ambitious here, he could have tried, say, rook to e1, then swinging to the c-file, etc. But instead he goes for this fairly forcing line. He checks, it forces Alireza to block. Now he takes on a7. Alireza now swings the rook across. The queen only has one square, and Alireza's forced to capture here, or you're just completely worse. After the pawn recaptures, we're then in this rook endgame where yes, black is a pawn down, but actually it's going to be very difficult for white to convert. So we had rook g4 here. The players are coming up to time control. I forgot to mention, by the way, earlier in the game, Alireza was a full hour ahead of Teimour. Really well prepared. But then he just slowly started to give it back on the clock, and they were roughly even at this point. Few minutes to go to time control. So we had king takes on c5 here. Rook takes on g7. And we're heading towards this liquidation. We reached this one, 2-on-1. What you really need to understand here is if we imagine a position where these two pawns get traded and then it's just the g-pawn, well, this should be a draw because the black king sits in front, the black rook is too active, should be a draw. But okay, Teimour plays this one out. I'm going to kind of whiz through these moves here. You can see how it developed. What you need to understand here as black as well is you don't trade the rooks. So after this rook actually hits e3, offers the trade. Of course, Alireza doesn't go for that one. The king and pawn endgame's lost. Now white's going to try and make progress in just a moment. At the minute, Teimour's shuffling, but soon this rook's going to come back round to b6. Look where it is now. We get a whole more load of shuffly moves here, and then this rook comes back to b6 check, king f7, and now g5. You have to try and make some kind of progress. But now rook a4 from Alireza. He cuts off that king. Rook f6 check. King sidesteps here, and once again we have some shuffling, just very difficult to make progress. Alireza's not swapping those rooks, no chance, but now the king starts coming in. But again, how do you actually make progress down the board here? If you push g6, for example, we're hiding on g7. Now this one's actually attacked by Alireza on f3. How do you defend? Well, here Teimour liquidates, and the players actually agreed a draw in this position here. Just to give you a quick flavour of why this is actually a draw, so to say the rook captures with check, king g7, rook b4, looking to come in here on the 7th. Well, black can just wait like this, rook b7, king g8 steps back. Now you can't step in with the king, the rook is chopping it. If white waits, black waits as well. And if you start pushing the pawn, the king just gets way too exposed. So you can even wait here, rook a3, say pawn g7. Well, now you can just keep waiting. The moment the king marches in, well, then you start checking here, and you can actually just check forever. And here's a really nice finish, by the way. Say white went king to g5, well, you can actually come here with check. And if you move the king, well, you capture the pawn, that's a draw. If you take, this is a nice stalemating trick. So okay, Alireza drew his game today. Great fight, but ended in a draw. Now in the other games, we had a draw between Duda and Rapport. Then in the Ding Loren versus Jan Nepomniachtchi game, well, that one was really exciting. Jan actually won with the black pieces. Ding's face just looked so pained at the end. You know, I really felt sorry for him when he went down like that with white, round one. Great game by Jan though. And then in the Nakamura-Caruana encounter, so Naka had black, Caruana went for this exchange Roy Lopez. You don't often so much see that. And Naka actually went down to it. Just a really positional crush from Caruana. Knights against bishops, and he got the victory. So a very exciting round one. Do stay tuned for my games coming up. Do subscribe. Never miss one if you haven't done so already. Thanks very much for watching. And to watch another classic epic game, click here. Thanks a lot and speak to you soon.